Hey, everybody, welcome back. I'm Emily Moyer, and this is Strange Mosaic. And we have a cool show today because this is the first time I'm having on as a guest somebody who is from the Project Kids group. I imagine we've been doing the Project Kids group for almost a year now, about 10 months. And so, most of the people who come and join us stay. Some people have come along a little bit later, but and I'm sure at some point there'll be other people from the group that sort of bubble up and become guests on shows and whatnot. But today is the first. And so Erik Peterson, welcome to Strange Mosaic. It's nice to have you here.
Thanks. It's good to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. And a couple of things, right? Like there's some people who are part of Project Kids or playing the Glass Bead Game kind of stuff that have no interest in being on the YouTube, right? And then there's others who they may be game with it, but sometimes it takes a little bit of time being on screen or on camera to develop the comfort level to be able to be on a show for 2 hours. And you started your own YouTube channel earlier this year, right? Is the show is Esoteric Journey, or is that the channel?
So the channel is called Esoteric Journey, but we do the shows. It started out as a show on Thursday nights where we would have different people join us if they wanted to jump in on on a Zoom call, and we would just discuss different topics. And then it just kind of grew from there. I started to do my own stuff because I was tired of waiting around for Thursday night, and I wanted to put more material out. And I had this vision to, grow it and make it something else, and eventually do like a podcast. So it's sort of just branching out at the moment.
I noticed you have a new concept, Unraveling Reality or whatever, that you just have started in the last couple of weeks. So seems like some things are starting to take shape for you.
Yeah, I mean, it's like my own Glass Bead Game, and I didn't want to call it that because I mean, you guys have already done that, and I think that's cool what you and Michael are doing. But in a similar vein, I'm looking at the same type of connections and getting into stuff that's interesting to me, that's relevant to me. And so we just started that with the Carlos Castaneda stuff, and fascinating. I've got a lot of other stuff planned too for it. So I've been talking Michael Wachter, who you've done a show with Nish with. He and I started it together, and he's been really busy, so he's kind of stepped away right now, but we're still in the talks about doing a podcast and just set up like a Facebook group and an Instagram thing, and just doing the old typical promotional stuff. But
cool.
There's a lot of stuff we want to get into.
Yeah. So Erik isn't part of the Project Kids group, and he comes and he plays lots of Glass Bead Game with us. And but kind of just let people get to know you a little bit, right? So just tell us a little bit about your background and sort of how you came to play the Glass Bead Game.
Sure. Well, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I'm from the Midwest. I'm from Kansas City. I grew up, probably it wasn't until 2006 that I really started to get into this kind of stuff, where I guess I quote unquote woke up, or got into the conspiracy stuff. And I remember I was going to a community college class, taking this math class, and I hated math. And there was this guy in there, had really long hair and this ponytail, and I remember his name was John Preston. So John Preston, if you're out there watching this, I still remember you, buddy. He told me you should check out Coast to Coast Radio. Never heard of it. So, one night I was driving to the grocery store, and I just was flipping through the radio stations, and it came on, and I wasn't even looking for it. I'm like, oh, this is what this guy told me about. And, it was some guy talking about the number 9. Mm-hmm. And the way he described the number 9 and all of its magical and mystical properties, I immediately wanted to start teaching myself math, because I just wasn't very good at math. At least I didn't understand it the way it was being taught. And so that led to me becoming more of an autodidact and just teaching myself things and going down all of these rabbit holes. And so, eventually I finished school, got a degree in economics, and, got this job, moved out here to DC, and been out here since 2009. but just like a lot of people, I was spent a lot of time watching YouTube videos and researching and reading books and like looking into all of these different things. And at some point, I was tired of thinking that I had everything figured out and then realizing I don't know anything. Some new piece of information comes along and just kind of blows your mind up. And I just, more and more, I got to the conclusion that, life is pretty much like an alternate reality game. And, whatever analogy you want to use, that like this, it's real, but it's not the absolute real of reality. And, I was in the military for a while. I did like 4 years in the Navy. Had a lot of interesting experiences there. That's kind of where I got into like the party scene, going to raves and stuff. And probably my first entryway into drugs, like more than just every once in a while. Like high school, we experimented with acid and, the other typical drugs, but it wasn't until I was in the military, going to parties, that I started to, move into like ecstasy and meth and coke and all of these harder drugs and K. And so that was an interesting 4 years trying to avoid getting caught.
So a couple of things. So we are just let people know, like, sort of the inspiration for this conversation was that, Erik and I have each had very interesting and anomalous experiences and revelations and abilities revealed to ourselves on drugs. And we're going to actually get into talking about that later in the conversation, like maybe even in the patrons hour, but probably there will be some in the public hour. But I wanted to kind of talk a little bit with him just about his background here first. And then I think we're going to get into something we were talking about right before we came on. But I wanted to ask you, was your time in the military before or after John Preston?
That was before. So let's see, like 96 to 2000.
Mm-hmm.
I was like stationed on an aircraft carrier. Got to go, we were stationed in Norfolk, Virginia. And so we went all over the Atlantic. Like we went down to the Virgin Islands. We went over to, the Middle East, went through the Straits of Gibraltar, I've been to Spain, Italy, France, Israel, went through the Suez Canal, got to see Egypt, just all over the place. So, for a guy who was like 20, 21 years old at the time, it's pretty exciting. But I got out right before the bombing of the USS Cole, which was several months before 9/11.
Yeah.
And so I just was done with my military right before that whole thing happened.
So what does, like, when one is in the Navy and traveling around, like, what is it that you do, especially if it's at a time where we're theoretically supposedly not at war, right? Like, are you guys just going sailing? Like, what's going on?
Pretty much. I mean, my job was to work with ordnance, so bombs and missiles and guns and explosives and stuff like that. But I spent the majority of my time cleaning things. We cleaned a lot of metal. We dusted. I was part, they'd stick you on these working parties where you'd have to, like, a line of people down these stair hatches, just putting boxes of food in a giant freezer for like 8 hours a day. So it was not glamorous. It was not exciting. Most of the ordnance was inert, so it wouldn't blow anything up. Every once in a while they would fly live stuff, but for the most part, it was kind of like a really boring, draining job. It was 130 degrees in the shade, in the like the Gulf. So the Persian Gulf was extremely hot. But yeah, nothing really happened.
So it's so interesting. So it's like, there's this, like, you're there, you're doing these, this thankless, hard work, but it's work that, like, does it really need to be done? Because do we really need to be there rolling around in the Middle East with inert weapons? Right? Like, it's like, it's like creating chores for people to do just for the sake of, like, the mind control, or this idea that we need a military and we have to have, I mean, think about, I'm thinking about that. Like you're rolling around with inert weapons, doing chores and tasks like moving boxes of food up and down the stairs, and the taxpayers supposedly are paying for that, right?
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
It seemed like most of the time, it seemed like a giant waste of money.
Yeah.
But I guess somebody had to be out there, that we were quote unquote patrolling the no-fly zone.
Right.
So, that was before Saddam had fallen. The Gulf War was, the first Gulf War was over, but we hadn't yet invaded Iraq again. So it was like he was hiding these quote unquote weapons, and we were there to kind of do flyovers and patrol this no-fly zone. Honestly, I just felt like it was all a game. It was like a little joke that, they were playing, because there were people that, that died while I was out, but it was mostly from just human error, right? Accidents. Yeah. Forklifts were, lifting off this giant fuel tank off the roof of the hangar bay, and it fell on a guy's head and killed him. Had another guy jump off the back of the aircraft carrier because he couldn't take being out to sea anymore. And like helicopters had to go out and try to find him. And I think he just drowned.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I saw a lot of people lose their minds. You're out for 6 months with very little time off the ship. And you got like 10,000 people on there. It's like a small city. So, it can be stressful. But for the most part, if we were actually at war, I don't even know what that would have been like.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, we'll get into the time in the military also coinciding with your entree into like the rave scene and harder drugs and stuff in just a little bit. But I wanted to pick up with what you and I were talking about before we came on the air. There's always the pre-show is always, pretty good. Sometimes we get the pre-show on recording, but this time we didn't. But we had started talking about so first we were talking about this interest that his father and my father both interested in, like African culture and African American culture, my sister as well. So we had been talking a little bit about that. And then we got into, Erik told me that he works for the same department that his father used to work for. So, and that, and I had said, oh, that's interesting. I said, my sister and my dad had the same advisor for their PhDs, like 30 or 40 years apart. And your next comment was, sometimes I wonder if my life is just a script that I'm just sort of living out. So pick up there. And then I said, let's record. So pick up there and tell me about what's going on for you. Because I have sort of a theory I'm trying to work out. Like I'm trying to figure out if it makes sense and if I can plug enough holes that it's a logical thing to work from. But I want to hear what you have to say about why you feel like your life is a script, and you're just sort of playing your part. Let's hear.
Yeah. Well, my mom and my dad kind of split up when I was about 2 years old. So my dad was around, but he was always, in another state with another wife. And he had a daughter with my half sister, and like I don't really talk to her much.
He had a daughter that was your half sister, not a daughter with your half sister, I hope.
Right. Yes.
Okay.
So he married this woman, Diane, and they had a daughter, Ashley. So I grew up, I'd visit her every once in a while. I remember they lived in New Orleans for a long time, and when I would first go visit her, that's when MTV had just come out. So it was right around that time. And I was a little bit older than her. And then my dad, they moved to LA, right? But they had to live, like my dad worked in downtown LA, but they had to live like an hour and a half outside of LA because LA is pretty expensive. And so, eventually my dad got transferred to Chicago. Then of course, he got divorced again for a second time. And then he moved to Chicago and he met this woman, Roberta, who happens to be African-American. And he went through this weird period where, he was like researching slavery and all of these things. And he got, really into that. Like he would definitely be a BLM guy, and so he married this woman who's a wonderful woman. And he was working for the Department of Labor, and he was investigating labor unions and stuff. And so when I went through school, I studied economics, and one of the first places that I applied to was, the Department of Labor, not because my dad worked there. I just sort of found out later that I was almost like in the same department as him. But when I got the job and I went out, I moved out here, this woman, there was 3 people that were getting hired on the same day for the agency that I work for. One of the guys was a Marine, and we shared an office together. He was also an economist. But this other woman was an investigator who was investigating, like claims of minors who were filing, like harassment claims or, workman's comp claims, stuff like that. She knew my dad because she used to work in the same office as my dad, and she'd heard my dad speak before at a conference. And so it was just like all kind of coming around. Like I had gotten divorced, and I had a son with my wife, and he's with her, and so I just felt like I was becoming my dad. And like my whole life I wanted to be completely different than my dad. I didn't want to do things the way he did. Not that I don't like my dad, it's just I saw things differently, and I found myself somehow doing all of the things that he did, making all of the mistakes that he made. And it just occurred to me that, I'm living out a script that's like built into my DNA somehow. And I'm wondering, are my kids going to end up like me, like I did with my dad?
So that's interesting. So I think that in my family, at least, it's much more my sister who's turned into my father than me. Although I do have probably some of the same annoying habits and characteristics my dad has. Yeah. Yeah. Right. I'm not the neatest person in the world. And I like to talk a lot, and I don't know, but my sister also, like, right. So my dad has a PhD in African history, right. And my sister's is in Black studies, and they both did the predominant, like the most of their work for their PhD in South Africa, where they both went to the University of Cape Town and both had Chris Saunders as their advisor many, many, many years apart and worlds away. My father, like when apartheid was basically still going on, my sister just not that many years ago, right? But it's been interesting. And Chris Saunders lived part-time in Cape Town and part-time in London, where my father did get his PhD. My dad's PhD is from University of London School of African and Oriental Studies, and my sister's PhD is from Howard University in Washington, D.C., right? But they both had Chris Saunders as, part on their sort of, you have like a whole team of people who are sort of on your advisory board for your, thesis, all that kind of doctoral, whatever. I don't know. That's not my stuff.
She had the same advisor, but at a different university.
No, so she had an advisor at Howard, but starting from the time she started going to South Africa when she was still getting her bachelor's program at Santa Barbara, right? So she went on an exchange kind of thing, or on a trip there, both in bachelor's, master's. She got her master's at Cornell, right? And whatnot. So she was getting advised whenever she would go over to study in South Africa or as part of a program. But when she was writing her final thesis, Chris Saunders, and when she was at University of Cape Town, she was in Cape Town for quite a bit of time doing studying, and he advised her, right? And he had advised my father when he was there. And I just think it's interesting that he's from London, right? So it's just kind of, and University of, like, I don't know what his other attachments are other than University of Cape Town. I don't know if I should ask my dad. I don't know if he also worked at University of London. But he goes back and forth between the two, same as my dad was doing when he was getting his PhD and when he was doing all of that stuff. So, it's just interesting though, that all those years apart, I do think that, like, it's at least, there's a very normal explanation for some of it, like, right? Like families tend to start businesses and they pass them down to the oldest son kind of thing. And I think it's pretty normal in families that have a lot of children for at least one of the children to follow in the footsteps of a career of the father, generally, right? Or the mother or whatever, you
To
know,
some degree,
to
yeah.
some degree. But yeah, no, I mean, it is interesting to watch. It's almost like, you know, especially like in my case, where I think there's something else going on behind the scenes as far as my, like, I think whatever's happening with me is largely like more in my mother's footsteps, right? But there's a connection to what's going on with my father and my sister. And that seems to be more following in the footsteps of my father's family, right? I don't know. Like, I can't figure out like what the whole connection is. But there does seem to be something to this sort of like passing down, right? Like, I have cousins who each are following in the footsteps of something that their parent did, or, you know what I mean? So, and we're not a traditional family, right? Like, if you have this like blacksmithing business that's been in the family for hundreds of years, you're generally a pretty traditional together family. Like, I wouldn't consider that to be ours. So I don't know what some of it is. I don't know if it's agency secrets that are being passed down and this is the cover for it, or
Well, I
what it
think,
is.
like, if you look at the past, it's probably very common for especially sons to take over the business that their fathers were in, especially when you're talking about blacksmithing or shoesmithing or any
Yeah.
kind of, you know, career that involves a trade or in art form, right?
Yeah.
Where you have to study it and get very, very good at
Apprenticeships
it.
in it and things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But in our modern age, where, you know, there's so many different things people can do, or at least they're told that they can do all of these different things, and then they find out after they spend all that money on a degree that there's very few things they can actually do or that require a degree to begin with. Like, when I got a job with the government for economics, you know, I was amazed at like the guys I was working with had PhDs in economics from Princeton. And, you know, I just couldn't understand how they were able to do that because they didn't seem very all that bright to me. Uh,
Yeah.
you know, I don't know. But, you know, nowadays people can do so many different things. So I think it's rare to see, you know, children following so closely in the footsteps of their parents. And so that's why, you know, for me anyway, I wanted nothing to do with that. And somehow I just ended up there. Right. And, but yeah, I mean, it's funny because I look at my family, like my dad's side of the family, he had a sister and a brother. And, you know, his parents were very religious, right? They were like fundamentalists. And so he was raised in that kind of Christian environment. And to some degree, he's still like that, right? And I think also his sister and his brother to some degree, but like my cousins are like me in a way. I've been finding out I have a cousin that lives in Washington State who's like homesteading, and he and his wife like against vaccines and they don't trust the government. And I got like another cousin who's starting to question things. So I see my generation at least starting to break away from these
Yeah.
patterns that they were falling into, because a lot of us did. We were kind of following in the footsteps of our parents. Like, there's this script and you can either follow it, right, or you can try to figure out who you are and what this place is and what we're doing here. And then at that point, it's like you push the script to the side and you really just start living your own life.
So a couple of things I want to, then I want to get into this theory about why the script may be, right? And how it may really operate. But what is it like to be a person like with, you know, I'm sure you and I don't agree about everything, but I'd assume that like in general, our thoughts on the world probably align pretty closely. What is it like to be a person who doesn't trust the government, working for the government, and who believes a completely different set of ideas about reality than the structure of government would dictate? What is it like to be that and working in the government?
It's a paradox for sure. When we were actually working in the office, you know, it really wasn't, I just kept to myself. I mean, there was a few people, I would always look for those people that showed signs that they were questioning reality, or, you know, didn't really buy the full story on everything that was going on. And I'd get into conversations and I'd look for opportunities to just drop little nuggets of stuff like, oh, you know, but what about this? Have you ever thought about this? And, you know, because sometimes if you do it in a very nonchalant way, people don't immediately get defensive. But yeah, for the most part, I mean, I just kind of stuck to myself. I got into some heated arguments. One of those PhDs that I was mentioning, when I first started working there, he loved to come in there and strike up conversations with me. And we would get into it about climate change or something. He'd bring up these topics of the day and, well, I saw this thing on climate change. What do you think about that, Erik? And I'm like, I don't think about that at all. And then we'd get into this argument and he'd tell me that I was crazy. And I'd tell him, like, get the fuck out of my office. And my boss had to talk to me a few times. And I'm like, I'm sorry, but that guy just really bugs me. And yeah, so, it's been tense sometimes, but for the most part, it hasn't really been that difficult because I just try to keep that stuff to myself. And I just don't get into all of these conversations about sports. Like they would come in and like, did you watch that game? I'm like, let me stop you right there. We're not doing this.
But then if any of them came to talk about tennis, you'd be open to that conversation, right? But
definitely.
It very important, in my opinion, very important part of understanding and playing the glass bead game, tennis. Right. So
it's amazing the way you talk about it too. Like it made me get back into tennis because I had sort of stopped watching it for 5-6 years. And when I heard you and Michael going on about the glass bead game and relating it to tennis and Federer, and I'm like, wow, tennis is so much more interesting again. Like
that when I first started doing show, like, I don't know, sometime like the first year that I was doing stuff, like Robert Phoenix had me on to talk about occult or esoteric tennis. And I did like a whole hour and a half or 2 hours just on like tennis, right? And we got deep into some stuff. And he and I, it's always been a feature of our Matrix Mash and stuff together. But yeah, like I just, I could go on and on and on about, I do it when we're sitting here watching and I'm like looking at the angle of like the sign from the sponsor against the backdrop of what, you know what I mean? I'm like, there's an altar there. Like, this is like, this stuff can't be accidental in some of these scenarios. Right. And, and the backgrounds of the players are always really interesting to me and whatnot. But anywho, the point wasn't to get so much into tennis right now, although I do like to talk about tennis. But it was really, I just want to, since you brought up climate change, right? Like, so it's interesting. That's one of the topics that can get people's like panties in a wad, like real tight, right? Like even somebody who can like sort of entertain, the political conspiracy talk or like, some other aspect of it. Like I had this really interesting experience at a party once, and I probably told this story somewhere before, but I was at this party in downtown Los Angeles, as I often am. And like I had decided I was going to go outside and get some fresh air. Like I just decided it in my mind, right? And because I've been dancing, and this guy comes over and grabs me and he's like, let's go outside. I want to talk to you, right? And this guy looked like Bigfoot, dude. This guy had like full facial hair, like on this part of his cheeks.
Wow.
Right? So like he looked like Michael J. Fox in Teen Wolf or something like that, right? Like it was the weirdest fucking, and like all, full disclosure, I was on mushrooms, right? And I probably had a little meth running in the background. But it's so like, you always are asking yourself is like, is this because I'm fucked up? But I'm looking at everybody else and like, there wasn't a bunch of Teen Wolves all around me or anything like that, right? So either this guy really had this facial hair or this guy had some energy that was so strong that my mind was projecting that onto it because that was the energy that he was emitting, right? So we go outside and we start talking. This guy's super nice and super interesting. Like, I don't know if he was thinking I was cute or why, or he liked the way I danced maybe, because that was during the period of time where I had like a lot of crazy stuff going on with my skin. So like, I didn't even like people to really look at me, but I was always a good dancer, even at the worst of my, whatever it was. So I don't know what the appeal was, but he had pulled me outside and we got into this really interesting conversation. And what I started to recognize is like, he didn't know what I was talking about with some stuff, right? And this was before I like was really too far into, like I was already exploring, like, I mean, I was familiar with and aware of like parallel realities, dimensions. I don't know if Mandela effect was a term yet, but I was starting to notice things like that. but I didn't speak fluently in that. But what I had started to recognize, and this was before there was evidence of it, was that like we didn't all get the same internet, right? Like this was before it became a thing that there was algorithms or whatever, right? But we're talking about stuff, and everything that I talk about, he thinks it's something else. Like in whatever reality he was from, there was a musician named Alex Jones, right? So like I said something about Alex Jones, and he could not grok what I was talking about, because he's like, no, dude, there's this guy named Alex Jones. He's a musician. He wrote this song called Little Pink Houses or something like that. I'm like, no, where I'm from, I think that's a John Mellencamp song. Like, what the fuck are you talking? Right? Like, it was literally like we were in different realities. And at that point, I assessed it to like, maybe we have different internet. He'd never heard of Alex Jones. Like that happened with like about 10 things I brought up. He'd heard of them, but he thought they were something different than the thing that I knew them to be. But there was only one thing that existed as both the same thing in our realities, and that was climate change. Right? But he believed in it and I didn't. And he was willing to entertain everything. I mean, we talked for probably 2 hours, right? Like I told him about the MK Ultra shit. I told him about what I thought was going on with me. And he was like, good. But when I said I fucking didn't believe in climate change, he about lost his shit, right? So like when you see Teen Wolf start to, you remember like how, like remember in the movie when he would get upset, right? Like it would get sort of different and whatever. It was like, it was the fucking weirdest thing. Like I said some crazy shit, but as soon as I said I don't really believe in climate change, I was like, yeah, I mean the climate changes, but it's not. But I wasn't willing to. So it's interesting. Like let's just say he's from a different reality. At this point, I'd more portend that maybe he was from another dimension, right?
I think
but it's
you're from a different reality.
Or I'm from a different reality or whatever it is. But like now, if I were in the same situation again, I wouldn't think he had a different internet. I mean, I'd know he had different internet. I'd think he's from a different dimension, right? Or he's from like a different version of reality, or like if you're into Tenet, the other side, or whatever it is, right? But it's interesting that that's a powerful psyop tool, no matter which reality you're in, right?
I've had those experiences too. Like when I first got into, conspiracy stuff, I was listening to this guy named Alan Watt.
Mm-hmm.
And he's in Canada, but every time I would bring the guy up to somebody, they're like, you mean Alan Watts, the philosopher?
Yeah.
I'm like, no, I don't know who that is. And now I do. But at the time I was like, who's this Alan Watts guy?
Yeah.
So I've had that happen. And I've had just weird, where I used to work so I live on the Virginia side of the Potomac River, and DC is like right across the Key Bridge from me. And I worked in this place called Roslyn. And I worked in there's 2 identical buildings in Roslyn that were sort of referred to as the Twin Towers. And so that's where my office used to be before we moved. And there was like out in the front, we sat on like a corner. So there was 2 busy cross streets, and they'd have the local Channel 7. I think it was an ABC affiliate. And they had their headquarters there, right? In the bottom level of this building. And they had the ticker thing running on the building and the giant screen. And so I would go out there at lunchtime, and, sometimes I would go out to smoke a cigarette or something. And I would always run into this guy that was a cameraman, and he did some technical stuff for the news crew. And, he was always out there chain smoking, an old guy with these like big, thick glasses. And for whatever reason, one day we just started striking up a conversation, and almost immediately he was just launching into all kinds of stuff that I was talking about to other people. And it was like, man, I really found somebody I can actually talk to here. And he seemed to get a lot of it, but then we would disagree on different conspiracy things. We get in these weird arguments about, no, it's this group of people that's doing it. I'm like, no, I don't think it can't really be that group. And then we would argue over, who's trying to rule the world or whatever. And it's just very interesting. And I've always had crazy people, I wouldn't call them crazy, just very odd and interesting people stop me or come up and talk to me out of nowhere for no reason. And I've always had like the strangest interactions with people.
Yeah. All right. So let's get into like this thing about life, like maybe the possible reason for like the script or something like that. So I have a couple of thoughts, and I don't know if they're all part of one idea or if they're two different ideas, but I keep having this vision of like time is moving this way and we're moving this way. We're not moving with time, right? So based on some of like the latest episode of the Glass Bead Game will go out tomorrow. So people will hear that, like people who get the Glass Bead Game will hear that before they hear this show, but you haven't heard it yet. It will be tomorrow. Michael and I get into like an experience, a technique, right, that might explain an experience that I had where I seem to have traversed 21 years from one location, right? Like I seem to have this experience in these locations where they seem to advance myself from the 1999-2000 period of time to now, right? There seems to be some sort of like, those are the, I don't know, like the temporal pincer movement. I don't know, whatever it is, right? I seem to experience like a 21-year loop in these areas or something like this, right? And I was trying to understand like, okay, so if I went in 1999 or 2000 into the future 21 years, right? It seemed to be that seemed to be where I was traveling to was now, right? Like I'm now experiencing the things that I caught a peep of back then. What would be the purpose of that, right? And so information collection, why, right? Like, are they like, did I come forward into the future and let somebody know or whatever, or maybe I'm just having my own personal experiences and it's weird, but they're able to do this with other people, right? And the reason is information collection. But how is it that I got a peep back then of what's going on now, and then things developed to match that almost exactly on a certain level, right? Like, wouldn't that, so it's like, is time really moving the opposite direction than we are, right? And so they're having to backfill things in, right? To avoid something happening. Right. So people think that like, okay, the reason to do like mind control and MK Ultra kind of stuff would be like, you're trying to create all of this stuff. But what if it's a reaction to something? What if they already know based on like, okay, like in Tenet, the way time flows in opposite directions on each side of reality, if something has already happened in your reality, or if you've peeped into another reality, maybe I went into like another dimension, but the same time period, and it was almost exactly the same, but not quite. If I saw something on the other side, you'd be able to get out ahead of it, right? And change it before you get there. Or if there's something that you want to have happen, make sure all the things happen between now and then that will ensure that thing that you saw happen, right? Does that make sense?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think too, like, I'm thinking like, what exactly is remote viewing?
Right.
So can you just remote view a future place and time? Right. I mean, I think that if you can remote view a place in the current time, right, you can remote view a place in the future.
Right.
So, I mean, it sounds to me like what you experienced was a mix between, like it's a memory to you, but it's also like a dream as well. Like, was I actually there doing all of this stuff? But because now it's all happening and you're like, this is what I remember doing, but I don't think I ever did it before. So
it's kind of like, so I would have these like loss of time that I can't tell you if it was dreams or if it was like, when you space out during the day, or if it was like drugged or an MK Ultra sort of taken out of your bed at night kind of thing or whatever. But I would have these experiences where I would see places or see things, right? And they'd be very foggy, but I would sort of remember them. And then I'd go looking for the stuff, right? And I couldn't find the stuff. And I did spend plenty of time looking in the same area that I am right now, but I couldn't find it. But now it's there. Right? So I had to have moved into the future with whatever the experience was to see something that is there now, but wasn't there then.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So my question is, if that's how things, if time is really moving in both, let's just say it isn't like, let's just say it's flexible, or like time is omnidirectional everywhere, but they've managed to create, based on some sort of technology or frequencies or some anomalous thing, like this sort of this bubble. The guy sent me the bubble blowing thing, right? Like they've created this bubble where time only seems to advance in one direction, even though everywhere else outside of said bubble, it's flowing all over the place in every direction. And there's people inside the bubble that for some reason, whether it be because of training, right, or happenstance, or certain kinds of like areas where there are sort of portals or energy fields that allow the other thing to happen, that get moments outside of like the organized, structured time, space, linear thing within the bubble sort of thing, right?
The thing about Tenant that was confusing though to me was
the whole thing. The whole thing.
Yeah. when they're in the reverse time, right? Everything is moving backwards except them, right? But everybody else that's moving backwards, they're actually, it appears to them that things are moving forward, and that the person that's not supposed to be there is moving backwards. Right. And so then it becomes difficult to tell, like, who, you know, was the guy actually from the timeline that's moving forward, or was he from a timeline that's actually moving backward? Like you're sort of left not knowing which is the real timeline.
Right. So everything about that music, I hate those movies, to be quite honest. Everyone's like, oh, they're genius. I'm like, sure, on a certain level, but like, I don't like when I have to work that hard to understand something that's supposed to be entertainment, because we already are working that hard to understand what's going on all around us all the time. So like a little mystery is fine in the movies, but like the other thing with all those movies is they're so loud, you can't actually hear what the people are saying. And so like you have to keep rewinding it. You have to like be like this. It's just not enjoyable to watch the fucking movies, right? But I think it could be more like they dramatize these things. They can't really give you all of the information. I think it might have to do with spin, right? So I've had a number of people say, like energy healer people, psychic people, you know, whatever, say that like my spin goes in the opposite direction of everyone else's. So even though like I look the same, right? When I walk, I'm moving forward. My like gravitational spin or whatever they call that, like I have like I had to do, like I used to have a really hard time like fitting in energetically with the people around me. And I had to do exercises to try and get my energy body to, like, I have one going one way and one going the other way to try and like, you know, make it so that I could fit in a little bit better. But that spin going the other way may be the thing that sort of allows these odd experiences that I have, right? And I've just sort of like learned how to balance that better now. But my question is, okay, so if I've been able to do this 21-year thing, and from some documents that we found, it seems to be symbolically 21 is an important number, right, for that program. But you know, I'm sure there's lots of people doing this. I'm sure I'm not the only one, right? So if you're trying to make sure like that everything, it seems to me that my life had to unfold in a way that I would end up here now, right? It was all about me being here now. So somehow I was here back then and I peeped my being here now. But what if like the other thing, you know, what if there's some sort of technology, Looking Glass or any of these other things we've heard about, like, I don't know, right? Where they're really able to see far forward or far back in time, or if it's omnidirectional for them, like the setup for me being here now may have included me being here then, right? And then from there, like all of these steps, like when you really start to think about it, is like, if this person who can travel into the future has to have these attributes, what's going to get, like, because they know this person exists now, what's going to make sure this person exists and gets to this place? And I think that's where we even get into setting people up as college sweethearts, like kind of thing. Like my mom and my dad, like it doesn't really make any sense that they were together. They don't really have anything in common. Very different kinds of people, very, very different backgrounds, not really interested in the same stuff, right? But it was only the combination of those two people that would put together the genetics that would make me.
Well, I'll tell you what I think, and then I have a story that kind of goes along with that, and I think it might tie into what you had, your experience. So the way I've come to look at time, and like I'm not stuck on this model, right? Because things always change. But I see like past, present, and future are all happening at the same time. Like there is only this moment of time, right? And so all things are happening at the same time. And because of that, right, like whatever's happening in the future is going to affect our present and then also the past. And so this would also explain the Mandela effect. I know people call it like retro causality. So there's this ripple back and forth, like a wave that's going back and forth, and it's oscillating, but it's also changing things within the present, past, and future. Now, there was a guy, I guess he had, his whole life, he was kind of an outcast, and he ended up, when he was older, going to some like ayahuasca retreats. And on one particular occasion, he was trying to do some healing, and he remembers that he was, he had done ayahuasca, and he was sitting there and he was focusing on his younger self, and he was telling his younger self that everything was going to be okay, right? And he was just beaming out this energy to his younger self. But he remembers when he was a kid, he would have these weird visions, like he wasn't asleep, and he would open his eyes and he'd see this old man's face looking at him and telling him everything was going to be all right, as he was going through something really difficult at the time. And so he was actually watching himself from the future tell himself.
Yes.
And then he didn't realize who that person that he saw was until he did that. And then he was coming down off the ayahuasca and he looked in a mirror, and it's like he just instantly realized who that old man's face in the mirror or in his vision was when he was a kid. So I think it's very possible that you could have just sort of jumped into yourself now, right, when you were 21 years ago, and experienced some of these things and then jumped back. Like it's definitely plausible to me.
Especially if you like, I think there's a number of ways this can be accomplished. So one of the things, and you'll hear like us talking about this particular document, but I didn't really get into this aspect of it. But with this technique of traveling into the future, right? One of the things to do is like, you can do it when you're like sleeping or when you're in like this super meditative state, is to crawl out of your body and basically come out of your body at the end of the bed and look down over yourself after you've stood up. Right. So it's kind of similar to a person standing over the space between waking and sleeping, and somebody standing over you saying everything's okay. For me, it was part of my like sleep paralysis experience. And I always felt like, who is that figure standing over me in the bed? Now, some people who have sleep paralysis, you'll hear from them that it was an alien, or it was the slim man, or it was this, that, or whatever. I just saw a shadowy figure. There was never any aliens or ghosts or anything weird happening. It was just, I couldn't quite make out who it was. But it could make sense that it was actually me standing over the bed just after I had come out of my body or before I was about to come back in, right?
Like your shadow self. Yeah.
Or yeah, right? Like that, it's a technique for leaving the body to go into the future or into the past to collect information. You have got to come out of your body first to be able to move in that environment. Right? You can't, right? So like with this technique that we'll be talking, it's, this technique that we're talking about. So there's that, but then there's also, there's the technique of that, but then there's also, you can be in a location and exactly what you said is true, right? Like if I was in that location then, and I'm in that location now, because time is always present, there's a connection between those two, and the energy signal of that is particularly noticeable in the same space, right? So like one of the ways that I know that's true, even from small examples in life, is like, I always like, if there's a party, if there like is a club that I go to over and over, or a party that I go to over, like that's in the same location a couple of times, because sometimes it's like, with the raves, they tend to move around, but every once in a while a similar spot will be used, and you don't really know till the night of the party, but like you'll get like, oh, I love this place, I'm glad it's here, right? And in those places, I have the same spot that I like to dance. And it's generally because I had that good experience once there before, and that energy signature is still there, and I can go right back to that place and sort of pick back up on that feeling or that energy. It sort of continues to compress there and build up over time and whatnot, right? So there's that. But then also like when I first was in that space between getting off of drugs and getting clean and all that kind of stuff, right? Like I had started a job. Like I didn't work for a number of years when I was on drugs, but when I started a job before I got clean, and the job was as a merchandiser, right? And I would go to these different markets and set up these things on display, right? And in the last couple months of my drug use before I got clean, like I had gone to this one store one time, like I was fucking out of my gourd. I was like, so like I was really fucked up, and not necessarily fucked up where other people could tell, but like, you know, the experience when you're just like, I should not be here doing this right now, but I have to do this. And every other time after that, even like when I was a year clean and year and a half, 2 years clean, when I would go back to that store, particularly like in this one aisle that I had been working in where like I was just like, this is not good, I could feel that agitation in myself. That energy was still there. And as soon as I'm there, it's like you connect with it in no time. There's no time between those two times, right? So
it's like you leave these little pockets of emotional energy behind you.
Yeah.
And they're always there. I mean, or maybe they dissipate over time, but you know, other people can probably pick up on them too. So maybe somebody else is like shopping in that particular area and they're like getting this crazy feeling and like, what is that?
Yeah.
I've had those weird feelings in places and I can't for the life of me figure out why I feel so weird. And you know, it's got to be something like just an energy that was residual from somebody who left it there.
It's a pattern, like it's a frequency or a pattern. So you've seen me show this on a number of other shows, but this is just really a perfect example, right? So here's Jeff Mills's shirt, right? So like, and I've said this exactly. So here's me in one location, this particular location I'm talking about in Austin, right? You can say this is 2021 and you can say this is that 1999, 2000 period, right? And so I have moments when I'm on those locations where like the two, like there seems to be a direct path between the two, right? But all of this are the lives that I've been living between that, right? Like I had to go on this winding road. It wasn't just like straight shot from one to the other. I was here in 1999, 2000, and I peeped this. And right now, when I'm having these peeps, it's connecting me back to here. But in between, there was all this crazy stuff. And it's probably omnidirectional, right? It probably goes both ways, right?
You can fold it too. Like if you were to fold it in half, those points would overlap each other. And you would see 1991 and this time now at the same point.
Well, and this project that I'm talking about, like the name of the advanced level of the project where somebody traveled into the future to gain information about the future was called Focus 21. Now, I don't know if they meant they were looking to see what it would be like in the year 2021, or if that's the 21st level of the program, or if 21 years seemed to be that time span that the jump would happen. The past time travel seemed to be, it was called Focus 15. Now, interestingly enough, 2015 is when I got clean, right? So that was interesting to me as well. And that was when I first, like, that was the period of time when I started to kind of understand how all of this stuff worked. But yes, if you just folded those two things on, what you actually have is, what's the name of that trinket from Inception? Trinket from Inception.
Oh, the top.
Is the top, right? That. You basically have that, which is also the inverse of the four lobe shape, right? So if you have the quatrefoil, there we go, quatrefoil pattern. Let me find the kind I'm speaking of. There's a variety of quatrefoil patterns, but if you have, so if you had this going all like one after the other, the inverse.
It's like 4 Vesica Pisces.
Right, so the inverse would be, let me see if I can find one where there's like here, right here. The inside of that is that same shape.
Yeah.
So if we folded Jeff Mills t-shirt over, we would have a top, and the top is the inverse of that 4-lobe shape. So
it reminds me of a labyrinth as well. And
yeah,
like we have several labyrinths that we've been discovering here in our area, just like labyrinths that are in parks. Mm-hmm. And, you know, as you walk a labyrinth and somebody else is ahead of you, like I get the idea that, you know, they're in the future, but like time is winding around. And so there are points, right? And probably at a certain period of time, or like on a cycle almost, where timelines will be very, very close to one another, where the opportunity to jump. So maybe 21 years, or, you know, whatever the number might be, is like that window. So like your present at a certain point on your present, you will be very, very close to like 21 years in the future. And, you know, if you know how to do it, you can just jump in and jump back out before the window passes.
Yeah,
Because
I mean, it's
people walk
probably
by you
something
and you
like
can
that. Yeah.
touch their hand. And so,
So it's interesting, like there's this thing called the 7-year itch, right? Where people tend to make major changes in their life, like they might change jobs or change locations or spouses. Like 7 years seems to be where something is, right? So 7 times 3 is 21, right? And I actually, so what's interesting, I moved here in 1999. And then I lived here again in like, I think 2008. So almost 7 years, right? And then I came back for some visit like 2015, 20, like right around that. But like, if you think about it, people might go and they might move from place to place. Like I moved around from Los Angeles to New York and blah, 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 right? But after like 3 of those, somebody might circle back to the place that was a favorite, right? So 21 years actually makes sense for a certain cycle, right? Like, you know, if the aim is the 21-year place, a person might have their first experience with that rodeo at 7 years, maybe another little opportunity for that at 14, and then 21 is like when it sort of comes full circle, right? So I don't know, it was just interesting that that's divisible.
why does 21, like you have to be 21 to drink in most states?
Mhm.
And I think that's it, right? It's 18 to vote. But like for whatever reason, 21 has, you know, like you can vote, you can buy a gun, you can do all of these things before 21, and then, but you can't drink until 21. So it's always seemed odd to me.
So I didn't move here when I was 21. I moved here the first time when I was 24. But what's interesting is like, just like I talked about in one of those shows where we were talking about Deborah Harry, and I was like, I had all this like Blondie and Atomic sort of tagging and programming. It was during that period of time that I lived here that I also started tagging things often with the number 21, which is weird. Like generally people add a number to like their email addresses or their passwords. It's usually based on like the age they are or the year that they're born in or something like that. I don't know why I use 21, right? Like I use 21 for like a lot of stuff, but you know, like I started tagging things with that then. So it would be interesting if this number of 21 was really programmed into my head. And now it is 21 years after I was here the first time. And in the period of time between there, I actually had a car called a Focus. When I lived back here in 2008, I had a car called a Focus. So I have this Focus thing and this 21 thing. And it all began with a Gateway, which was the computer I had when I first moved here. You'll see in the show that we did tomorrow, right? But it's like weird. Like you think about like, you know, how do these projects and programs work? There has to be ways that these ideas are reinforced that seem innocuous to sort of keep you on track. I mean, think about when you're going to a school, right? When you are like, when you were in college, when you're at wherever you are, like you often have a notebook that has the name of your school on it, right? So like if you were to forget where you were going to school, it would be right there to remind you, not that you would forget, right? But think about or if you're on a sports team, how many pieces of clothes do you have with that on it?
Well, yeah, I mean, exactly.
So if that's the team I was on, wouldn't it follow that I would own items that reinforced what I belonged to?
Yeah.
That would seem innocuous. Like it's like an easy way to sort of hide that, right? Like not walking around with a t-shirt that says like, I'm part of MK Ultra project, this, that, right? But I still have all of these items and like marker points around me. And you'll see another thing I do with Michael tomorrow. It's actually kind of crazy how many of them that there are. Right?
What if you had that t-shirt made and you just wore it around Austin, right? Like
Yeah.
I was part of an MK Ultra program and just, you know, see who comes up to you and strikes up a conversation.
There's like strains of marijuana called MK Ultra that they sell at some of these cannabis shops now. So my guess would be that would be people's first thought. And then after that, there's a DJ called MK Ultra. So I think that would be people's second thought. So I think it would go marijuana first, DJ second, and then maybe somebody would ask what I was what I was talking about. Right.
I think that, you know, like everyone, when you hear MK Ultra, everyone thinks, oh, mind control, assassin, whatever. But I mean, honestly, the more I really look at this stuff, I really feel like a lot of these MK programs are really there to unlock potential
Mhm.
abilities within
I,
people.
I agree. And I also think that it's like, so I think things go terribly wrong and they get used for things they're not meant to be used for. But yeah, I mean, I think yes, unlocking human potential, but also I do think that like maybe there is a like if you knew something was coming, like let's just say that we know that there's some crazy warfare going on with China and shit like that. Like, what if it's worse than we understand? Like, what if like it's really bad and this has been something that's been coming for a long time and they're really like having to figure out how to perforate into other dimensions because Huawei is going to absolutely like dominate this dimension with their 5G technology, right? And so you're having to see, is it going to be possible for us to jump, right? Like one reality over outside of their frequency band where they can't affect us. Or I'm just making something up. I'm not saying this is
I think I just watched something recently that had this plot, but the force that so they were trying to create superhumans in order to battle this. Oh, was it? I think it was Fringe, right?
French
Where
in French. I was just gonna say, yeah,
yeah,
French.
so
That's
like
the point.
the threat is always coming, like this great alien threat, so we have to do all these drastic things to unlock these people's powers. And yeah, there's going to be some side effects, and there's going to be some collateral damage, but and then of course it's always the end justifies the means kind of thing.
Right. I mean, and things always come back. Of all the shows we've all ever watched, I think there's been the most hints and clues and things like that in Fringe, almost more than any others. But if you think about the way that the series resolved itself, right? Like it resolved itself in that it closed the paradox in a way that they don't even ever actually remember having traveled into the future and had to really battle these observers in the way that they did. Right? Like Peter's just back home and gets the letter from Walt, the rose in the mail, but Walter ended up never having existed in his life, so he didn't even know who it was coming from. Right? Because Walter had erased himself from reality.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing too. Like, I don't know. I mean, so it's like 15 past. Did you want to move into like a second hour thing and then
yeah, just to close that. I mean, if you think about it, right? Like I'm just like what if it's entirely possible that whatever it is that the future travel was for has resolved itself, and so we're just kind of living in this other aftermath where we're having a pretend crisis, right? But we've really avoided the main crisis, and so we've passed the point of where the answers are going to be, and we're just sitting here talking about it because we're trying to make sense of the figure eight we just performed, right?
like, well, 12 Monkeys was that always hit me, was like, okay, so if you guys never invented time travel in the first place, then none of this would have ever happened, because this group wouldn't have wanted to spread this virus. And it's so, it's like the cautionary tale, right? We always want to push science further and further and further, and you can't always know in the present what the ramifications are going to be of that in the future. And so
yeah. All right, we're going to wrap up the first hour here. We're going to move into the patron section where we're going to talk about the good, the bad, the ugly, and the really interesting of hard drug use. And so you guys can join us at patreon.com/offplanetmedia or emilymoyer.locals.com for the rest of the show. But before we go, Erik, let people know where they can find you.
yeah, so the best place to find me would just be Esoteric Journey on YouTube, and also there's a Facebook group too, so it's just Esoteric Journey Facebook group.
All right, awesome. We'll see you on the other side, guys.